Can one stitch of love save a life? If one day, you're out collecting a small debt you thought was insignificant, and you suddenly catch a glimpse of deep, sunken black eyes, stitching thread after thread in the shadows, would you turn away? Or would you stop? Julian Castañeda didn't stop. At least, not at first. He was a successful businessman. His world was glass and steel, air-conditioned boardrooms, and rows of digits on glowing screens. His life was balance sheets, contracts, emails signed with digital footers. He didn't have time for trivial things like compassion. That afternoon, Julian stepped out of his sleek black SUV, parked crooked along the damp curb of an old apartment block. He didn't even shut the car door. The wind howled through the opening, carrying with it the sharp scent of bleach and the fumes of old engines from the nearby market. His face tightened. His imported leather shoes clacked across the cracked cement. He was not in a good mood. That morning's meeting had been a string of meaningless words from people he didn't care to hear. And now, he had to come all the way here, just to collect a few months' worth of overdue rent from a tenant 3 cycles behind. He stopped at apartment 4B. Peeling paint, rusted nameplate, the sour scent of mold crawling through every crack. He exhaled and knocked. Once. Twice. On the third try, just as his hand was about to touch the wood again, the door creaked open. No voice. No greeting. Only, a child. A girl. Maybe 7. So thin the collar of her shirt sagged loosely around her neck. Her eyes were black and still, like unmoving water. Her hair was tangled. Her small hands clutched a half-sewn piece of fabric. Red, blue, and yellow threads still hung from the edge. "Is your mom home?" he asked. His voice dropped, as if something in the air made him speak softer. The girl shook her head. Didn't speak. Julian bent down. For the first time in years. His gaze unsure. Behind her, a dim yellow light cast shadows over a rickety wooden table. And on it, an old hand crank sewing machine. Scraps of cloth were stacked in fractured piles. On the cold gray tile, a few dried drops of blood near the tip of a scissor blade. She was sewing. In an hour when she should have been in school, or outside playing, or napping peacefully. But she worked. Silently, steadily. As if the weight of the whole world was pressing down on those tiny shoulders. Julian swallowed. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl didn't answer. She only looked up at him. And in that moment, every calculation in his mind fell silent. He stepped back half a pace. It felt like he had been pushed away. Not by poverty, but by a kind of truth he hadn't dared look at in years. I just came to collect the rent," he said. Even he could hear how out of place it sounded. The girl lowered her head and whispered. "Mom left it, in an envelope, under the mattress." She walked slowly into the back. Not hesitantly, but with purpose. Each step seemed to measure the breadth of the whole room. She returned holding a crumpled envelope. Grease-stained at the corner. Inside, a few old bills, not even a fifth of what was owed. Julian didn't examine it. He took it like it was a fragile object about to shatter. He didn't step inside. The girl didn't invite him. Everything froze for a few short seconds. The sewing machine began again. Steady and rhythmic. Like the heartbeat of someone enduring to the very end. And for reasons he couldn't explain. Julian didn't leave. He stood there. A millionaire man in a spotless shirt and polished shoes. watching a frail little girl sew line after line, as if her mother's life was stitched into every needle drop. In that moment, he wasn't a landlord. He was simply a human being. And maybe for the first time in years, he felt what it meant to hurt. He didn't know how long he stood there. He only remembered her hands, still turning the crank, each stitch piercing fabric like a necessary breath. The soft yellow desk lamp lit up her tiny fingers, bruised from needle pricks. And the sight silenced any logic in him. "What are you sewing?" Julian asked, his voice hoarse, like something had broken inside his chest. The girl looked up. For the first time, there was a flicker in her eyes. "A pillowcase," she said. "Miss Letty upstairs ordered it. If I finish fast, she gives a few extra coins." He nodded slightly. His mind began assembling the missing pieces. Empty pill bottles by the bed. The faint scent of antibiotics. The stains on the fabric. The heavy air in that boxed-in room. "And your dad?" he asked, though he already knew. She shook her head. Not angry. Not sad. Just a shake that was too familiar with the word gone. He glanced at the kitchen. A scorched pot sat abandoned on the gas stove. The fridge plugged in made no sound, but carried a rancid smell. This wasn't just poverty. This was a home. Paused. He stepped back. His spine hit the door frame. His hand instinctively clenched the crumpled envelope in his pocket. Suddenly, collecting rent felt like the most absurd thing he'd ever done. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. "Teresa," the girl replied. Her lips pressed tight. A simple name. But it echoed through his mind like a sad song in a place with no music. He sighed, as if breathing in all the exhaustion buried in this room. He meant to leave, but he looked at her again. Those eyes. They looked through him, not begging, not pleading. "What's your name?" "Valeria." For the first time. She answered quickly, clearly. As if her name was the only thing she still owned in a collapsing world. "Valeria," he repeated, letting the syllables roll on his tongue. Like a quiet prayer. Then, without a word, he reached into his wallet and pulled out some folded cash. Not enough to fix everything, but maybe enough for a few meals, a little medicine, a bit of restful sleep. He set the money on the table, next to the sewing machine. Valeria didn't look up. Didn't thank him. Just kept sewing. As if no one had ever stood there. Julian turned. The wooden door closed softly behind him. He descended the stairs slowly. Like someone who had just witnessed something he wasn't supposed to. Back in his SUV. It felt like a glass prison. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Pressed suit, neat hair. But suddenly, it all felt meaningless. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay on a clean white sheeted bed, in a luxury apartment downtown. But his mind was still in room 4B. Still seeing Valeria under the dim light, sewing that pillowcase. He didn't know what haunted him more. Her silence. Her eyes. Or maybe that he had seen something of himself in her. A child no one asked, "Are you okay?" A grown man devoured by his own success. Before the sun broke through his penthouse window, Julian was already up. No suit. No office. He stepped out with a grocery bag. Bread, milk, fever medicine, soap, and a tiny packet of fruit candy. It wasn't on his calendar. It wouldn't show on his financial report. But it was the first time in years he felt. I still know how to feel pain. And maybe I still know how to love. He returned to apartment 4B. This time, not to collect a debt, but to begin something else. Maybe redemption. Maybe healing. Or simply, to begin being human. The silence in the hospital room wasn't comforting. It had weight. Every breath Teresa took was a struggle. Every squeeze of Valeria's hand was a silent prayer. Wordless. Without scriptures. Only the heartbeat of a child. Fighting against a world that was pushing her mother toward the edge. Julian stood by the doorframe, trying to keep his shoulders from trembling. He didn't want to intrude on the moment between mother and daughter. But he couldn't walk away. He simply couldn't. He watched Valeria lean in and whisper something into her mother's ear. Teresa blinked faintly. A weak smile appeared on her lips. The light from the window fell across her pale skin. As if even the sun itself was bowing in helpless sorrow. A nurse stepped in, politely reminding them that visiting hours were nearly over. Valeria bowed her head, then gently tucked her mother's hair behind her ear. Pulled the blanket up to her chin, and whispered, "I'll come again tomorrow. I promise." As the two of them stepped out of the room, Julian said nothing. He knew any words right now would feel hollow. But Valeria turned to him. Eyes puffy, red from crying. And yet something in her gaze had changed. It wasn't the look of a scared child. It was the look of a warrior. "Mr. Julian," my mom said. "I should trust you." Julian froze for a moment. In that instant, he was no longer a landlord. No longer a man with contracts in his briefcase. He was simply a man. Trusted by the most fragile child he had ever met. And to him, that was a responsibility heavier than any legal document he had ever signed. They left the hospital in silence. On the ride back, Valeria stared out the window, eyes unblinking. Just before reaching the apartment block, she spoke. "Uncle, if I get kicked out, would my mom still find me?" Julian slammed the brakes in the middle of the street. He turned to look at her. The question hit him in a place he thought he'd long sealed off. His throat tightened. He asked, softly, "Who told you that?" "There was a woman in black. She came while I was sewing. She handed me a paper and said I had 3 days to leave. I didn't understand all of it. But she said there were no exceptions." Julian closed his eyes. Gabriella. He didn't need another word. Only Gabriella could have done this behind his back. The woman who handled paperwork and properties like a general on a battlefield. Cold, efficient, and blind to the blood on the front lines. He inhaled sharply. His hand gripped the steering wheel so tightly he could have bent metal. "No one's kicking you out," he said, steady and firm. "As long as I stand, you and your mother will have a roof over your heads." Valeria gave a slight nod. Then turned away. But he saw it. A single tear rolling down her cheek. Not from fear. But maybe because for the first time in years, she felt someone was truly on her side. They returned to room 4B that afternoon. But what they saw stopped them cold. The door had a new lock. A white paper was taped to the front. "Eviction order executed. Do not enter." Valeria froze. Julian rushed forward, yanking the doorknob like a man gone mad. Inside were all that was left of the mother and daughter. Fabrics. Threads. the sewing machine, photographs, and they were gone. Because of a decision that had no soul. Valeria didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply turned away, descending the stairs slowly, like someone who had just lost her homeland. Julian followed, rage boiling inside. He knew this was no longer personal. This was war. And Gabriella had just crossed the final line. That night, Julian brought Valeria to his home. A spacious apartment with polished hardwood floors, soft sofas, and warm, elegant lighting. But Valeria just sat quietly in a corner. She didn't explore, didn't touch a thing. She hugged her knees, eyes distant. "My mom won't know I'm here," she whispered. Julian knelt beside her, voice low. "I'll bring your mom here. No matter what it takes." Valeria looked at him. Her eyes didn't need to say thank you. They just needed one promise. A promise that would be kept. And he made that promise. That same night, he picked up his phone. The first call. To his private lawyer. "Prepare the case. I want Gabriella brought before the board. If needed, prosecutors too. She's abused her power." The second call. To the hospital. "I'm transferring patient Teresa to the best private hospital available. Handle everything. And tell me the cost if we need to move her to the U.S." The final call was to himself. A question he hadn't dared ask until now. Can a man who's lived only for profit really save a child from losing her mother? But then he looked at Valeria, now asleep on the sofa, in an oversized shirt, her tangled hair falling over her eyes, one hand still gripping the corner of a pillow. And he knew, even if he didn't have the strength, he would still try. With every beat of his heart. A long night fell upon the city like a heavy curtain. From the high-rise balcony of Julian's apartment, the world sparkled with lights. Busy and unrelenting. Just like the machine that had once hardened him. But now, the only sound he could hear was his own heartbeat. Loud. Heavy. Aching. He took out his phone and called Clara, a veteran nurse who had once cared for his dying mother. Clara wasn't just skilled. She had a steady heart. "Clara," he said, "I need you to care for a patient. Her name is Teresa. She's at Central General Hospital. But more than that, I need you to be with her daughter. She needs someone. More than anyone." Clara's voice was calm. "I'll be there before sunrise." And Julian, "Thank you for not leaving them behind." He said nothing. Just stared down at the traffic below. The world still rushing by. As if nothing tragic had ever happened. At sunrise, Julian returned to the hospital. Valeria was already there. Sitting in the hallway. Holding a half-empty milk cup. On her lap, a small bag of lollipops and cookies from his apartment. As if they were all she owned. He sat beside her. "I called a friend," he said. "Her name is Clara. She'll care for your mom. And stay by your side when I can't be here." Valeria nodded. But didn't look at him. "My mom didn't open her eyes last night." Julian gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "But she's still breathing. Still here. Still fighting, right?" "Yes. Then we fight too." He didn't know if she understood every word. But for the first time, her eyes turned toward him. Steady. Without doubt. And then she leaned gently against his shoulder. Not for long. Just 1 second. But it was enough. By evening, the doctor asked to speak privately. His eyes already said it all. Teresa's condition has worsened, he said. We've done all we can here. There's an experimental treatment at a private hospital. But it's expensive. And risky. Julian didn't hesitate. Transfer her. Tonight. I'll cover everything. Are you sure? She's Valeria's mother. I'm not sure about anything. Except that she deserves a chance. That night, Julian rode in the ambulance. Valeria sat beside her mother, gripping her hand tightly. He walked alongside them. Silent, but unshakable. The siren wailed into the night, like a battle cry against fate. At the private hospital, things moved fast. Paperwork. Examinations. Admission. Teresa was placed in intensive care. And Valeria, small, exhausted, but eyes burning with fire, refused to sleep. She sat by the window, never leaving the hallway. Julian stood there, watching it all. He didn't know how much money he had spent, how many meetings he had missed, or how many deals were waiting for his signature. But he knew this. He had never been more himself than in this moment. And he also knew his battle with Gabriella had just begun. Can a child hold on to faith when everything she loves keeps being taken away? And can an adult, after years of emotional numbness, become a shelter for a soul so small, yet so broken? That day, after leaving the hospital, Julian didn't go home. He went straight to City Hall, carrying all the paperwork required to request legal guardianship of Valeria. He knew this was the moment when everything had to be laid on the line. Law versus conscience. Duty versus love. There was no turning back. He would fight for the right to protect that child as if she were his own. The civil clerk flipped through the documents. You're not her biological father. No blood relation. And the mother is still alive. This is a very unusual case. I know, Julian replied firmly. But when a child has no one left but a man willing to give up everything for her, blood is no longer the most important thing. The clerk stared at him for a moment, then sighed. We'll review it. But this won't be easy. And it won't be quick. I'll wait, Julian said. As long as it takes. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Teresa began to show her first signs of recovery after surgery. Her tongue was numb. Her voice weak as a whisper. But there was a spark in her eyes again. And Valeria, always there, like the last sunbeam left in her mother's life. One sunny afternoon, while Clara went home to change, Valeria quietly pulled out a notebook from her backpack. Inside, she had drawn little dreams she once stitched in colored thread. A house with a red roof. Her mom by the window. And herself riding a bike in the yard. In one corner, was Mr. Julian, holding a basket of bread. Mom, she whispered. If you get better, I'll sew all our dreams into something real. Teresa smiled faintly. A tear slid from her eye. But for the first time, it wasn't a tear of pain. That evening, Julian returned with news. He walked to Teresa's bedside, holding a small box. Someone sent this for you, he said, placing it gently beside her pillow. Valeria opened it. Inside was a brand new pair of sewing scissors. A box of pastel-colored thread pink, blue, lavender, and a fresh piece of white linen. It's from Mrs. Letty, Julian smiled. She said, if Valeria is going to keep sowing dreams, she'll need better tools. Valeria clutched the box to her chest. Her eyes lit up, like someone had handed her a sky full of stars. But just then, a message lit up Julian's phone, and it froze the blood in his veins. Gabriella has filed a complaint with the court. She's requesting a financial investigation regarding your illegal adoption. He clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The battle was far from over. That night, after Clara lulled Valeria to sleep with a fairy tale, Julian sat alone in the hospital lounge with his attorney. She's playing her final card, he said. If the court suspects I'm using this child for image or profit, I could lose guardianship. The lawyer nodded grimly. Or worse. Valeria could be sent to a state facility. Julian closed his eyes. He imagined that little girl, who had already lost so much, being taken from her sick mother, and forced out of the only place she'd called home. No. Not possible. What do I do? Prove that you're the only one who deserves to stay. And how do I prove that? In a courtroom with no room for emotion. The lawyer looked him in the eye. Then bring the emotion into the room. 1 week later, a temporary hearing was held to review Julian's emergency guardianship request for Valeria. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Just a single female judge. Gray-haired, but with eyes sharp as steel. Gabriella was there. But this time, her confidence had dimmed. Valeria waited in the next room, watching through a monitor. She wore a faded floral dress, hair neatly braided, holding a small embroidered bag that read, "Mom, I'm waiting for you to come home." Julian stepped to the witness stand. No lawyers. Just him. And a copy of Teresa's handwritten letter. "Your Honor," he began. "I'm not here to request ownership of a child. I'm here to make a vow to a soul in need of a home." He looked up, meeting the judge's gaze. "Valeria is not my daughter. But from the moment I stepped into that apartment and saw her sewing in the dark, my heart changed course. I can't replace her mother, but I can be someone who will never leave her." He placed Teresa's letter on the table. "This mother, sick and fading, still wrote these words to me. If I don't make it, please don't let her be alone. She is my entire world." Well, she's my entire world now, too. The judge sat silently for a long moment. Then she smiled softly. "Temporarily. Guardianship will be granted to Mr. Julian Castañeda. A final ruling will follow after full verification." Gabriella stood, clearly ready to object. But the judge cut her off. "If you wish to file further complaints, go ahead. But this is not a corporation. This is the life of a child. And what she needs is not a good attorney. She needs a father." When Julian stepped outside, Valeria ran into his arms. No hesitation. No fear. She looked up and asked in a trembling voice, "Do I have to leave you now?" He knelt and held her tight. "No, Valeria. From now on, I am your home. Sometimes, life doesn't need to shout to make a lasting impact. Sometimes, just a nod, a hand held, or a quiet smile in the storm can rewrite fate." 2 days later, Julian drove Valeria to the hospital as usual. She sat in the passenger seat, cradling her embroidered bag, now restitched with silver thread. Silent, as if sensing something was about to change. When they arrived, Clara stood at the room's door, her face tight with worry. "What happened?" Julian asked. As Valeria dashed inside, Clara held up a report. Teresa's condition worsened overnight. High fever, fluid in her lungs. The doctors say, if we don't intervene one last time, she may not survive the next 48 hours. Julian said nothing. He looked through the glass window, where Valeria sat beside her mother, holding her frail hand. Teresa could no longer open her eyes, but every breath fought to cling to life. Inside the room, Valeria placed her tiny hand over her mother's chest. "Mom, it's me." A tear fell on Teresa's arm. "I don't need you to cook, to sew, to work. I just need you to stay. Please, don't go outside." Julian stood motionless. His chest ached with every beat. He had seen people break under money and power, but he had never seen someone fall the way Teresa was falling now. Quietly, silently, yet fiercely, fighting death, just to hold her daughter one more time. He stepped into the room, sat beside Valeria. "The doctor has one last option," he said softly. "High-pressure oxygen therapy with strong antibiotics. But we'll have to move her. It'll be very expensive." Valeria looked up. "Can it save her?" "I don't know," Julian answered. "But if your mom still wants to fight, then we'll do everything." That afternoon, the doctor met them both. But instead of speaking over her, he knelt, eye to eye with Valeria. "Do you think your mom wants to keep fighting?" Valeria looked at Teresa, then back at him. Her lips trembled. "She promised she wouldn't leave me. So, she must want to stay." Julian didn't wait. He signed the transfer forms, paid the entire cost up front, and ordered a private ambulance. Teresa was lifted onto the stretcher, Valeria beside her, Clara with her medicine bag. Julian followed close behind, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was holding on to life itself. On the road, Valeria leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Mom, we haven't finished sewing our dreams yet." At the new hospital, the medical team was ready. Teresa was taken straight into intensive care. Julian didn't follow inside, didn't interfere. He just held Valeria's hand, and stood, strong on the outside, while trembling within. 4 hours passed, then 5. Finally, the doctor returned, his face tired, but his eyes shining. "She's still with us." No tears, no shouting, just one long, aching breath from Julian. Valeria nodded. She didn't need words. She knew. Her mom was still fighting. And for now, that was enough. 3 days later, Teresa opened her eyes. And for the first time, she smiled. Clearly. Valeria rushed into her arms. Careful, gentle, as if holding the most fragile gift on earth. Teresa stroked her daughter's hair, then looked at Julian. "Thank you." Julian sat down beside her, took her hand, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Teresa turned to her daughter. "Sweetheart, Would you like me to tell you a story? Valeria nodded. Yes. But this time, with your real voice. Not through a breathing tube. Their laughter echoed softly through the hospital room. Not loud, but enough to silence every fear that had once lived there. That night, while Clara cleaned the room, and Teresa slept her first peaceful sleep in months, Julian sat beside Valeria. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did something magical," he said. Valeria looked up, exhaustion in her eyes. "I just didn't want anyone else to disappear from my world." Julian nodded. "No one will. From now on, we'll keep stitching the rest of our dreams together." Valeria didn't reply. She simply rested her head on his shoulder and let her heart sow the rest in silence. Not every storm comes to destroy. Some arrive only to cleanse. And when the dark clouds finally part, we realize we're still standing. Not because the skies forgave us, but because our hearts learned to be strong. 3 weeks after the treatment, Teresa was discharged. She was still thin, still pale. But there was light in her eyes again. Valeria supported her gently down the hospital steps, hand in hand. A victory with no medals. Just the miracle of being together. "Where are we going, sweetie?" Teresa asked, her voice raspy. Valeria didn't answer. She simply tightened her grip and smiled. Then looked at Julian. He was waiting by the car, holding a bouquet of wildflowers freshly picked from the park nearby. He bowed slightly and said, "Welcome home." That small house, one Teresa never dared to dream of, was now the place she would call home. Every brick was Valeria's quiet perseverance. Every light was Julian's unwavering care. Clara had already prepared a room. A soft bed, warm blankets, a reading table by the window, and a drawing by Valeria hanging on the wall. A mother holding her daughter's hand among blooming flowers. That day, their first lunch together was simple. Vegetable soup, a few slices of bread, and warm water. But to them, it was a feast. Not because of the food, but because the warmth of their hearts was enough. But peace, as always, was fleeting. Gabriella, though suspended, was not one to back down easily. One afternoon, Julian received a letter from the Financial Oversight Agency. The company was being audited again, with a request to submit documents regarding recent off-system activities. He knew instantly. This was Gabriella's counterattack. She didn't need a title to keep striking. She had her underground network, unsure shareholders, and the fear of those who only saw numbers, forgetting that some things can't be measured in profit. Julian said nothing to Teresa. He knew she needed rest. But Valeria noticed. She saw the tension in his eyes. The way he stayed up at night, staring at spreadsheets, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. One night, while the house slept, Valeria brought him a cup of tea. "Are you scared?" she asked. Julian looked at her, surprised. Then nodded, honestly. "I'm scared of losing everything we just fought for." "I used to be scared too," Valeria whispered. "But my mom taught me. What we hold with love, the wind can't take away." Julian smiled softly, taking the tea. "You're wiser than your age." "I'm not wise. I've just had to walk through too many nights alone." The next day, Julian and his lawyer met with the company's internal review board. He brought every document, original receipts, Teresa's medical records, personal invoices, and most importantly, testimonies from Don Aquila and Mrs. Letty, including the key audio recording. At first, the board was cold. All they saw was risk, loss. But as Julian spoke, he didn't plead. He didn't beg. He simply told the truth. With compassion. When I helped Valeria and her mother, I didn't use company money. But if saving a life is considered a loss, then go ahead and write it down. One board member asked, "What if this costs you your leadership role?" Without hesitation, Julian replied, "I still have Valeria. I don't need a title to know I did the right thing." The investigation lasted more than 3 weeks. During that time, Julian never missed a hospital visit. He still took Valeria to school. Still came home for dinner. As if no storm were knocking at their door. Then, one quiet Friday afternoon, the board secretary came to the house. He handed Julian an envelope. Official results. Julian opened it slowly. After reading it, he looked up at Valeria, swinging her legs from the wicker chair. "We don't have to move," he said, smiling gently. Valeria jumped to her feet and ran to him. "We still have a home. Mom still gets to live. And you're still Uncle Julian." "That's right," he said. "The same Julian. Who'll always be here when you need me." That night, for the first time in months, Teresa sat in her wheelchair on the balcony, watching the night sky. Beside her, her daughter, and the man who once came only to collect rent. Now her most faithful companion. No rain. No thunder. Just a soft breeze. And the scent of jasmine in the air. Teresa whispered. "I thought I had become nothing more than a shadow." Julian answered softly. "You're Valeria's light. And light is never just a shadow." When it finally seemed like everything was stable, when people believed the worst had passed, that storms were now just memories, life turned unexpectedly once again. Have you ever wondered, can someone who once caused pain also be hurt so deeply they no longer recognize themselves? Gabriella came back. Not with another lawsuit. Not with schemes or rage. But with something even Julian didn't expect. A handwritten note. No stamps. No legal seal. Just one line. "If you still believe I'm human, meet me at the cafe on 12th Street, 5 p.m. Friday. Not to save myself, but to save the child." Julian read it over and over, not fully grasping its meaning. The child. His heart tightened. He thought of Valeria. Friday evening, he arrived right on time. Gabriella was already seated. Gone was the powerful executive in a gray suit with steel eyes. In her place, a woman in a plain brown sweater. Hair tied hastily. Her face pale. Her posture fragile. "You actually came," she said first. "I thought you'd ignore it." Julian sat without ordering. "No small talk. If you've come to use Valeria again, save it." Gabriella gave a faint smile. Her eyes hollow. "Did you know? Teresa and I are half-sisters." Julian frowned. "I only learned that through Valeria. You sought her out. She rejected you. And then you became the most ruthless person I'd ever met." Gabriella looked toward the street. "When Teresa was adopted, I was sent to a group home. We were promised we'd be adopted together. But they chose her. She was cute, healthy. I was frail, had a birthmark on my shoulder. So I was left behind. A 6-year-old in a white room. Rejected. For being imperfect. Julian listened. He didn't know whether to be angry or to feel pity. I'm not telling you this for pity, she continued. I just want you to know. Evil doesn't grow in a day. It's nurtured by years of being forgotten. Gabriella pulled out a photo. A little girl, maybe 5. Curly hair, chubby cheeks, wide eyes. This is my daughter, she said, voice cracking. Emma. I had her at 19. My foster mother told me to forget her if I ever wanted to succeed. So I gave her up and never saw her again. Julian clenched his fists. Valeria. No, Gabriella shook her head. Valeria isn't mine. But when I found out my sister Teresa had adopted a child not her own, I was jealous. I couldn't understand how she had the courage I didn't. I hated her for it. Her voice broke completely. But later I learned. Valeria is Emma's half-sister. Same mother. Different father. Both abandoned. But Teresa raised Valeria like her own. While I chased power, revenge, money, and lost everything. Gabriella looked at Julian. Her eyes empty. You don't have to forgive me. I don't expect that. But I have stage 3 cancer. It's terminal. Julian said nothing. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving behind a child who won't understand why her mother vanished. She placed a USB and an envelope on the table. This contains everything. Forged signatures, embezzlement, cover UPS, and my resignation letter. I have nothing left. But if I die, Emma will be alone. She's still in the system. Julian slowly took the envelope. You want me to? Gabriella choked up. I'm not asking anything. Just this. If one day you meet Emma, please don't look at her the way you once looked at me. That night, Julian told Teresa everything. She wasn't surprised. She only nodded. Everyone has a reason for their mistakes. But only the brave try to find the way back. Valeria sat beside her mother, listening. Do you forgive her? She asked. Teresa gently stroked her daughter's hair. Forgiveness isn't about whether they deserve it. It's about giving our hearts enough room to keep living. A week later, Gabriella was admitted to the hospital. No flowers. No visitors. But one afternoon, 2 people came. Julian and Valeria. Not out of obligation, but because a heart once lit by compassion can no longer ignore someone walking into darkness. Gabriella wept. Not because she feared death, but because, for the first time in decades, she didn't feel alone. When someone stands at the thin line between life and death, what remains isn't wealth or reputation, but a single question. Have I left anything of value for someone else? Gabriella passed away 3 weeks after that final meeting. No grand will. No relatives to claim her. Just a quiet final wish. Please take Emma somewhere she'll be truly cared for. Julian could have chosen to walk away. He already carried more than enough. But on the morning of Gabriella's funeral, as Valeria laid a wildflower on the grave of the woman who once upended her world. Julian knew. He couldn't turn his back. Emma lived in a group home deep in the outskirts. A large house with peeling walls and dried-up trees. Children ran barefoot through the dust. Their faces smudged, their laughter hollow. An old caretaker fanned herself beneath the noon sun. As Julian and Valeria stepped inside, they heard the sound of a zither. Faint, off-key, hesitant, but deeply sincere. They stood outside a dusty curtain. Inside, a girl around 9, with sun-darkened cheeks and shoulder-length hair, held an old wooden instrument. Her tiny fingers plucked each note, unsure but determined. "That's Emma," the caretaker whispered. "She doesn't talk much, but she taught herself music. It's the only thing she really holds onto." Valeria said nothing. She quietly stepped forward, knocked gently on the door frame. Emma, startled, looked up. And in that first glance, two girls, strangers by face but joined by bloodline, paused in a silence that said everything. Valeria smiled. She held out a handkerchief, embroidered with a single line. "Every wrong note can be fixed, if you still want to keep playing." Emma took it, silent, but her eyes shimmered. That afternoon, Julian sat with Emma privately. Not to pressure her, just to share. He spoke of Teresa, a woman who wasn't a birth mother, but who raised a child with nothing but love. He spoke of Valeria, a girl the world once left behind, who still chose to bring warmth to others. Then he asked, "Would you like to live with us? Not a mansion, just a small house. But there's someone there who'll be waiting for you every day." Emma lowered her head. "Did my mom ever hate me?" Her voice barely audible, like she was afraid the words would break. Julian swallowed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Gabriella's final letter. "My dearest daughter, I don't deserve to call you that. But if one day you read this, know this. Your mother was weak. I missed my chance to be a mother. But there's someone out there who won't miss his chance to be a father. Trust him, the way I never had the courage to. And if you meet Valeria, hug her for me, because she forgave someone like me." Emma sat in silence, then finally looked up. "Mr. Julian, can you teach me to play music?" Julian smiled. "I can't. But Valeria can." 1 week later, Emma and Valeria moved into the same home. 2 desks side by side. 1 shared bookshelf. A set of colored pencils. 2 toothbrushes placed next to each other. There were no legal bindings. Just 3 people. Each once broken, now learning how to start again. Teresa, now home in palliative care, was weak. But her voice had returned. And the first thing she said upon seeing Emma, "You've arrived." On Emma's first night there, she tossed and turned restlessly. Valeria lay beside her, whispering, "Are you scared?" Emma nodded. "I used to be, too," Valeria whispered. "But someone once told me, no one is born to live alone forever." "Do you hate me?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Valeria giggled softly. "Hate you? You're the first little sister I've ever had." That night, the 2 girls lay face to face, hand in hand, as if all their past winters had finally ended. The wind whispered through the window. Rain tapped gently on the roof. And from the kitchen, The scent of jasmine tea. Julian was steeping a cup for Teresa. Everything felt peaceful, as if loss had never lived here. Some bonds don't need blood to become family. But the law, cold and precise, still demands a signature, a stamp, a certificate, to confirm what should come from the heart. Julian realized this on a Monday morning, while taking the girls for routine check UPS. At the front desk, the nurse asked, "Are you their legal guardian, sir?" Julian froze. He never thought he needed a piece of paper to be a father. But in the real world, where care, schooling, even love has paperwork, he knew it was time to legalize his love. The social welfare office was harsh. Staff wore the same expressions. Blank. Guarded. Cold. You're applying for guardianship of 2 girls. Neither your biological child. No birth certificate listing you as the father. Not married to the foster mother of one. And the other's mother has passed, the clerk said, flipping pages. Yes, Julian replied. His eyes didn't flinch. You're a businessman. She raised an eyebrow. The same man once investigated for misrepresenting private donations, though not charged due to lack of evidence. Julian nodded. And you think someone like you will be approved? He placed 2 thick folders on the desk. Here are handwritten letters from Valeria's mother. Teresa Salgado certified. Her signed transfer of guardianship. Medical reports from the chief physician. School transcripts. Residential verification. Neighbor testimonials affirming our home environment. He leaned in. And one thing you can't stamp. I chose to love these children with my entire life, without waiting for anyone's permission. The process dragged on. Weeks of inspections. Surprise home visits. Separate interviews for each child. Every corner of their home examined. Even the medicine cabinet. The fire escape. Security cameras. In one closed hearing, a young official asked, "If biological relatives ever appear, what would you do?" Julian sat tall. "I won't stop them. But I'll ask. Where were they when these girls needed a hug, a bowl of rice, a hand to wipe away tears?" Life went on. Valeria joined her school's music club, sang a folk song solo in front of her class. Emma received a used guitar from her music teacher. She began writing melodies, and sometimes softly sang, "Mom, I'm okay now." Teresa weakened, but insisted on sitting outside each afternoon to hear her daughters laugh. She didn't speak much. She simply held Julian's hand whenever he walked near, and each time, her eyes said, "Thank you for doing what I could not." Then came the hearing. A modest courtroom, tense as a dream half remembered. A silver-haired judge, reading over 300 pages of case files. He looked at Julian, then at the 2 girls, sitting quietly beside him. Valeria Salgado and Emma Rivas. According to records, both currently reside with Mr. Julian Castañeda, in a stable household, with independent supervision, positive school and medical reports. He paused. "Do you both wish for Mr. Castañeda to become your legal guardian?" Valeria spoke clearly. "I don't need anyone to replace my mom. But if I could call someone dad, I'd choose him." Emma clutched her sister's hand, eyes red. "Me too." The judge smiled faintly. He gently tapped his gavel. Based on humanitarian grounds, legal eligibility, and the desires of the minors, I grant full guardianship to Mr. Julian Castañeda, effective immediately. Outside the courthouse, the sky was soft and clear. No fireworks, no cheering crowds. But Julian stopped, knelt down, and held out his arms. "My girls." And in unison, they replied, "Dad." For the first time in his life, he heard that word. Not out of obligation, but by choice. There are moments in life we wish would last forever. Just one more minute, one more second. To say what was left unsaid. To hold a hand we didn't know we'd lose. That afternoon, after the court granted legal guardianship to Julian, the three of them didn't go straight home. They stopped by a small shop near the park. Emma picked out a picture frame shaped like a heart. Valeria chose a clear glass vase. They were preparing a gift for the one woman waiting for them at home. Teresa sat on her rocking chair by the window, sunlight gently brushing the thin strands of hair she had left. She heard the familiar footsteps, the hushed voices, the soft click of the door. "Mom," Valeria stepped in, carrying the vase filled with white daisies. "We brought you something." Emma approached, placing the frame on the table. Inside was a photo of the three of them outside the courthouse, smiling in a way they never had before. Below it read, "Family doesn't need to be perfect, just never abandoned." Teresa stared for a long time. At each smile, each glimmer of light, each breath frozen in time. Julian knelt beside her and gently held her hand. "It's done. The girls are officially our daughters." A tear rolled down Teresa's cheek. But it wasn't from sadness. It was peace. That night, Teresa asked to sit out under the stars. Clara prepared a light blanket and a recliner. Emma brought her guitar. Valeria brought the old fairy tale book their mother once read aloud. The three of them sat beneath a lantern's soft glow. In the stillness of the night, Teresa's voice was raspy but clear. "Valeria, you were the first light in my life. Thank you for never giving up on me." She turned to Emma. "And you? You were the second chance I never thought I deserved. But heaven gave you back to me. I'm sorry I don't have more time to make up for the past. But I believe you found the sister and father I once dreamed of giving you." Emma covered her face, sobbing. Valeria gripped her mother's hand tightly, lips trembling. "Julian." He took Teresa's hand in both of his, as if trying to hold on to every last heartbeat. "You were the last act of kindness this life ever gave me," she whispered. "Thank you for not turning away." Teresa let out a gentle breath. Her eyes slowly closed. "Don't let them forget me." "Never," Julian promised. At dawn the next morning, Teresa passed away. Peacefully. Softly. With a quiet smile still on her lips. The funeral was simple just as she'd wished. No expensive wreaths. No long speeches. Just one song, sung by Emma beside the grave. "If you were the wind, I'd be the kite. If you were the rain, I'd be the drop that never fell." Valeria placed something on the headstone. The very first sewing needle she'd ever used. "To help you stitch the sky back together," she whispered. Life afterward wasn't easy. But it was no longer harsh. Emma began formal music classes. Valeria became the lead of her school's performing arts team. Julian reorganized his work and moved his office closer to home, so he could cook dinner, help with homework, and tell bedtime stories every night. One afternoon, as the three of them planted a tree in the backyard, Emma suddenly asked, "Daddy, if Mom could see me now, do you think she'd be happy?" Julian placed a hand on her head, smiling gently. "Sweetheart, she doesn't just see you. She is the warm sunlight on your shoulders." Valeria leaned in and whispered, "And the scent of flowers in the breeze when you wake up. One home, two daughters. A man who learned to be a father through love, not instruction. And a mother who left behind a miracle that never stopped blooming." That year, Valeria turned 18. On the morning of her birthday, she woke to a sunlit room. The old photo of Teresa holding her as a baby still hung on the wall. Teresa's hand still clutching the sewing needle she never let go. On her desk was a gift wrapped in lavender ribbon. Emma had woken early to make grilled cheese, Valeria's favorite. In the kitchen, Julian brewed coffee. His hair was peppered with gray, but his smile was still as warm as ever. "Happy birthday, my girl," he said, handing her a handwritten card. Valeria opened it and read aloud, "You were not born from my blood, but every day I thank the universe for letting me be your father." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but they weren't from grief. They were from gratitude, growth, and new beginnings. That afternoon, Valeria returned to Teresa's old house. The place had grown over with moss. She asked the new owners if she could step inside briefly. She ran her hand along the cracks in the wall. She walked to the corner where the old wooden sewing machine once stood. There, tucked into a crevice, was a tiny folded paper. She peeled it off carefully. In the shaky handwriting of a 7-year-old. "I promise to make Mom proud, even if I have to stitch with my own blood." Valeria chuckled softly. Tender. Surprised. She folded the note gently and placed it into her wallet. A keepsake like no other. That evening, on a small stage at her university, Valeria stepped under the spotlight. In the front row sat Emma, Dad Julian, Clara, Letty, and even Grandma Keela, all sitting quietly, eyes on her. Valeria took the microphone. "Has anyone here ever lived without a mother? Without a father? Without a home? But somehow, had everything? Because one person placed a hand on your shoulder and said, 'You don't have to carry this alone.'" The room fell silent. "That's me. And I'm not standing here because I'm talented. I'm standing here because I was once loved. In a way this world rarely dares to believe in." She cued the piano. It was a simple melody, one she wrote at 13. And she began to sing. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it found its way straight into the hearts of everyone listening. After the performance, Julian embraced her tightly. "I've never once regretted it." Valeria looked up and smiled. "Adopting me?" "No," he whispered. "Letting you choose how to love the world, even after it tried to break you." A month later, Valeria earned a scholarship to study abroad. She chose social work, specializing in trauma therapy for abandoned children. She said, "I can't rewrite my past, but I can help other kids write a better future." Emma was now a music teacher. She often told her students stories about the sister who once sewed with her own blood to save their mother, about a lantern in a storm, about resilience that defied fate. Years later, people would speak of a non-profit called Sueños de Hilo. Dreams from Thread. Its founder, Valeria Salgado. Its mission: to provide legal, medical, and emotional aid to abandoned children, single mothers, and families below the poverty line. Its symbol: a small hand holding a red needle, stitching back a broken heart. Valeria still kept her mother's old photo frame. Before every new project, she'd place it gently on her desk and whisper, "Mom, today, I begin another stitch." For a child still wandering in the dark. And finally, she wrote a book. Title: The Woman Who Sewed the Sky. First page: dedication to Mother Teresa, who chose me before I ever knew who I was. To Father Julian, who taught me that family doesn't share names, only promises. To Emma, the final stitch that held my heart together. And to those who once thought they were forgotten, you are not alone. Somewhere, a thread is searching for you. And you are the reason this world hasn't unraveled yet. 15 years had passed since Teresa's farewell. Now 30, Valeria stood silently in front of the rusted iron gate at the entrance of the old alley. The faded number 4B barely clung to the wall, but she recognized it instantly. The way you recognize your first breath. The beginning of everything. Beside her stood a little girl. Curly hair. Big, round eyes. A mirror of Valeria's younger self. "Mom, is this where you used to live?" the girl asked, eyes sparkling, as if peering into memory itself. "Yes," Valeria whispered, kneeling to tie her daughter's loose shoelace. "This is where I used to sew up rips with thread, and stitch a broken heart with tears." The house was abandoned now. Its wooden door warped and rotting. Its curtains hanging like torn sleeves, forgotten and unpatched. But Valeria didn't need to go inside. She simply stood there, closed her eyes, and reached into her purse. From it, she took a small object. A sewing needle, old, dulled with rust, softened by time. It was the only thing she had kept from Teresa. From those long nights mending shirts, stitching hope, sewing life back together. She handed it to her daughter. "Do you know what this is?" "A needle," the girl replied, tilting her head. "Not just a needle. This is our family's sacred object." "Sacred?" Valeria nodded, her eyes glowing in the late afternoon light. "It patched holes in clothes when we had no others. It stitched together our empty stomachs. It sewed a dream. And now, I want you to keep it." The girl cupped the needle in both hands, like holding a treasure. "But Mom, I don't know how to sew." Valeria smiled gently. "Neither did I. Until life said I had to learn." She placed her hand on the moss-covered wall, and whispered, "Mom, I brought your granddaughter. She's not as good with a needle as you. But I believe she'll learn. Just like I did." A breeze passed over the roof. A faint sound echoed, like the soft clink of a needle falling to tile. Valeria turned. No one was there. And yet, in the wind, there was something deeply familiar. Like her mother's sigh. Like her father's steady hand on her shoulder. Like her sister's eyes lighting up at the first piano note. Before she left, Valeria took a folded note from her wallet. On it, a line written in careful, slanted penmanship. "You can lose a house. You can lose a mother. You can lose the whole world. But you will never lose what a single loving stitch once held together." She tucked the paper into the gap of the old wooden door. Then she held her daughter's hand. and walked away, without looking back. Because sometimes, those who sew the sky back together don't need to stay in the place where it once fell apart. They only need to leave behind a thread for the next soul who walks into the dark and learns to stitch light. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? And how will you carry its message into your life? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.